Welcome. And as we are in the midst of these Deuteronomy passages, so again, we're going to have a continuation of that challenging passages that we looked at yesterday, and then move on to a new chapter. So I'm going to go ahead and screen share. And we'll start, of course, with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Place. Here we go. Here we are. So we're continuing with the conquest and how they have to deal with it, right? V'natan malchehem beyadecha. He shall place their kings under your power, right, in your hand. V'ha'avadata et shma mitachat hashamayim. I believe we actually did look at this particular verse. And you shall destroy their names from under the heavens. Lo yityatzev ish befanecha. No man will be able to stand up against you. Ad hishmidchacha otam. Until you have utterly destroyed them. So that's, again, we discussed how we try to interpret these words in a way where we learn some lessons from this without necessarily advocating genocide at all. I simply cannot accept that. To me, it's very difficult stuff. And we got into a little at the end of our discussion yesterday, of course, is there are people who would have no problem with that. Clearly, there are people who have little difficulty with destroying other human beings. But two wrongs don't make a right, at least in my book. And I'm not saying that in that context, it wasn't the correct thing to do. But that's its specific context, and I don't see it as a mitzvah for all time by any means. And it's a very, very challenging. These are very challenging things. Now, going on, yeah, go ahead, please.
It's sad though, because if it's in the Bible,
yes,
and people interpret the Bible differently, and people have used, of course, the Bible to justify slavery, to justify hatred and killing.
yes.
It's not the way we would do it, but we have a certain kind of, moral sense and sense of enough well-being inside of us to sustain that we can look at the Bible and say, kind of minimize it. Doesn't mean that we're entitled to keep doing something like this or whatever, but a lot of people don't look at it that way.
No.
And there are a lot of issues with the fact that it's in there because humanity is messy. It's not all us.
Correct. Okay, so let me address it. Thank you for bringing that up. Remember, very early on in this, what do you want to call it, class? I don't know. The sessions that we have. Remember, I talked to you about these kinds of passages and said that in a sense, I think the Bible is testing us, and it's really letting us know where our hearts are if we advocate such behavior. And I mentioned, first of all, there's the whole point at the very beginning of the Bible, right, in Genesis, where it talks about God creating human beings in the divine image. That doesn't mean, of course, that one doesn't have a system of justice, that one doesn't have to address, criminal behavior. One has to do it, but it has to be done with the systems of justice, dispassionately and fairly, etc. Now, in a situation of war, it's a much more complicated thing. Justice grinds slowly. And in a situation of war, it's a very sad commentary. Now, having said that and trying to address some of the issues that I feel you're raising, suppose we didn't have these statements in the Bible. If we didn't have these statements in the Bible, would that prevent people from behaving? The people who use the Bible to justify cruelty, etc., Do you think they wouldn't be cruel otherwise? Do you think they wouldn't try to find other reasons to justify their cruelty? Because I'm pretty certain they would. I mean, I think we're better off, without any question. I mean, I'm not trying to be euphemistic here, right? For the fact that we have these statements, not these specific statements that we're working with, but we have the Torah as a body to look at and examine and study, than if we didn't have it at all. And sadly, one thing that I've learned, of course, is that when you want to do something wrong, when you want to do something immoral, when you want to do something criminal, if you allow your heart to control your thinking, you can find rationalizations to justify your behavior. And we see it, by the way. I mean, there are so many examples, including the war against Ukraine, where the Ukrainian government was being accused of Nazism, etc. I mean, history is just full of these kinds of things. So yes, we have these particular passages in the Bible. And the way I try to deal with it is to say, number one is to look into ourselves, to see the enemies within ourselves and the need to really work very hard to overcome them. That I feel that pretty much most religions, if not all that I'm aware of, try to help us become aware of working against our impulses, of learning how to control our impulses. But that's, some of the issues that get raised here, and trying to take the Bible, can I say, if I may, without trying to be disrespectful, warts and all, and yet being able to try and turn it into something beautiful, I think is actually a life lesson, as to how we encounter reality and try not to deny those elements of life that are ugly, but try to find ways in which to bring them and relate to them in ways that are helpful and creative and compassionate, etc., etc.
I think
Go on, please.
I think what Lauren was saying was that she was just commenting about what people do in the name of their God,
Right.
with Bible, with other things like that. I think that's pretty much all that she was saying.
Well, Lauren, you're there. I think.
Well, it's a very, very popular book, but unfortunately, mental health and mental abilities and complex thinking is not popular.
Exactly.
It's the subset is pretty small of people who are looking at things, critically and trying to digest it the way we are and trying to use it to control impulses and to understand impulses, much less control them, think about them consciously, much less, that the people who do that and the popularity of the Bible is a very, very unfortunately, little subset. And as far as wars, I mean, wars are just chronic. They're not like something that there's a justification for this kind of violence and we're going to solve something with this violence and then it's solved and now the war is over and we're done. It's not like that ever. It's all chronic violence and aggression. It doesn't solve things. It just compounds and eventually leads to more skirmishes. And it's, yes, that's human nature, and human beings, unfortunately, are not using, the Bible. Maybe they are to the best of their abilities, but then their abilities, or maybe the ruby slippers, they don't know, but that's the way I see it. It's not, I know it's kind of a negative outlook, but I mean, all I'm concerned is like what you're saying about, trying to eradicate the enemies within me, I'm just concerned about myself, because I mean, you can talk about any act of violence and you can condemn it, but if you look at the roots and the precedents and all, this is what I was kind of saying yesterday, there were other acts of violence that led up to it. Mm-hmm. They're not just coming out of nowhere. This thing Jerusalem right now is not coming out of nowhere.
Right.
You would think so if you're looking at the news, but if you're paying attention to the whole picture, you'll see, dozens of people killed in Gaza, including 15 children. And this kind of thing begets that kind of thing.
Right.
It's just constant. It doesn't, I'm just reacting to your saying war was kind of an exception because I don't see it that way.
I'm only saying that it's a lot more difficult in a situation of war. I mean, should Britain have not reacted to Hitler?
Again, that whole thing, that there was something to react to, that in itself had roots.
I know.
It's just cyclical. And World War II hasn't solved the issues that idealistically one would have hoped it could have solved.
True. Okay.
I mean, there's no point in
No, I
debating
hear
the
you.
merits
I
of
hear you.
individual wars,
Right,
but every act of violence is just kind of this big chain of, aggression and tit for tat behavior and this versus that, and people who have, they're not on the track that we're trying to be on. Nobody involved with any of that.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And the only solution that I know of and is to try and discover what it means to be kind. And to recognize, because it seems to me in my naive way of looking at things, that so many things that were attempted through war could have been attempted had there been an attitude of kindness.
And not just kindness to your family and your friends and your community and those in your groups, but ways of looking for more fair distribution of resources, for instance, and kindness towards everyone, especially those that are marginalized and in, primed to become an enemy.
Right. So no, we're definitely talking about universal kindness. And there's this verse, I'm not sure if it's in Psalms or where exactly in the Bible, but I'm pretty certain it's a biblical verse. And it says, Olam chesed yibaneh, which means the universe basically is built through kindness or sustained through kindness. And kindness means, to me, the opposite of kindness is retaliation. And to see ourselves, that's the difficulty, to look at ourselves and recognize when our attitudes are retaliatory and to avoid it. And it's so difficult, right? Part of it is biological. The seminar that I've been taking fairly recently, where, when your buttons are pushed, do you recognize that? Are you able to stop where those buttons are going to take you when certain hormones now are, it's the sort of fight or flight reaction and stuff like that? And can you see it in yourself? When you're being mean, if you feel you've been treated unfairly, how capable are we of that? So, okay, I'm going to keep going, but I appreciate, obviously the points that have been raised and just how messy this can be. But here we are and looking at, statements in the Torah that we have to somehow deal with, at any rate. Psilei Eloheihem, the divine idols, right? These are statues of their gods. Tisrafun ba'esh, you shall burn in fire. Lo tachmod, you shall not covet. Kesef v'zahav alehem, the silver and gold that is on them. V'lakachta lach, and take it for yourselves. Pen tivakesh, lest you stumble bo through it. Ki to'avat Hashem Elokechahu, for it is an abomination. Actually, I like to translate the word to'eva as disgusting. I think that's a good way of understanding this word, for it is a disgusting thing to the Lord your God. And of course, this is capable of, a lot of thinking through as to what this is referring to, etc. And certainly where we put, money and things of that kind of value, of physical value, and where we place them in terms of our priorities. And so much of actually religious practice has to do with prioritization, and that's actually so much about it. So onwards. Velo tavi to'eva el beitecha, you shall not bring a disgusting thing into your house. V'hayita cherem kamohu, and you will be condemned like it. So condemned in the sense of condemned property, right? Shaketz teshaktzenu, you shall hold it as an abomination. In other words, you shall utterly reject it, right? V'ta'ev tetavenu, and you should consider it something disgusting, ki cherem hu, for it is something to be condemned. So again, the relationship to certain physical things, the worship of physical objects, etc. Something, again, in its own way, maybe not challenging in the way of the material we just read, but certainly also, something that isn't necessarily that we hold on to in a simple kind of way. It's a complex issue. Going on here. Kol hamitzvah asher anochi nitzavcha hayom tishmerum la'asot. All the commandment which I command you today, you shall guard to practice. In other words, you should faithfully do it. Lama'an tichyun, in order that you thrive, or vitem, and multiply, uvatem, and you shall come, v'yishtem et haaretz, and you shall inherit the land, asher nishpa Hashem lavotechem, which the Lord your God has promised or sworn to your fathers. Okay. All right, I'm seeing the comments in it. Basically, saying that love is the answer. Again, love is a general statement. And if you want to say that love is the answer, you have to define love specifically. And part of being loving is also looking in and not retaliating. So love, people speak of love, but it has to be spelled out exactly as to what is involved. So again, and you can keep, breaking these things down in terms of understanding what it is to be loving. Because sometimes love can be selfish, or what may appear to be love, or what we may think is loving, is actually selfish. And that's not the kind of love we're talking about here.
No, but it's many faceted.
It is,
because it involves caring and thinking of others and also yourself, but not to the point of being only yourself.
So these,
right.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking of it even just in that sense of loving yourself. I will tell you something else. These days, say within the last few months, I have thought kindness is even more important than love, because you can't love everybody. Okay. Yeah. But you can be kind. You can be kind. And kindness may involve justice as well. Okay. Well, love, you could say, is the same thing. But I find kindness a little clearer a statement than love. And partially because I think people confuse love and lust very quickly. And I think that's a problem, that people do confuse love and lust.
I can see that.
Well, this statement that we just read about inheriting the land also, is something I've always had trouble with. But, if you're looking at things the way we've been looking at things, where you define things differently based on wanting to control urges and have them, kind of pointed in a more godly way. Instead of saying, this is mine, not yours, you would say, this is mine, and I'd love to share it with you. I mean, this was given to me. I don't deserve it, but it was given to me.
Yes.
And I'd like you to have some of it too. I mean,
I
I've
agree.
seen it both in families and in schools, parents and teachers not being very fair with their attitudes towards the children in their charge in terms of what they give them both physically and emotionally. And instead of, running around, well, mommy gave me this because she likes me best. It's like, oh, well, look what I got. And you didn't get any, and I'm sorry. Here, take this part,
Mhm.
that's that's not ever dealt with that way. I mean, it's certainly, I think, part of the issue to, it's like, well, I know, we've discussed in terms of chosenness and what, the nuances of what that is. And, we do a little less about the nuances of inheritance, but, when it's not fair, when it's not fairly distributed, and, and yes, that's a meaningless word, fair, in a sense, and everything, because there's so many different perspectives.
Mhm.
But, if it's perceived as very unfair and somebody has really bad feelings because of it, and that, causes this tension and can, prep somebody towards a violent attitude.
Yes.
But if but if somebody else is more sharing and giving and looking to try to, not to cause a war because things are getting bad, but to look at ways to look at somebody else's perspective and what can you do to help them, feel that things aren't bad, that things aren't terrible and unfair.
Yes, part of the problem is how complex this problem really is. So, for example, there are people who perceive sensitivity as weakness. Okay, it's so deep. The other piece, of course, is some level of competitiveness is not necessarily a bad thing. I agree with you, Lauren, that I think that that holding on to this land and seeing it rather as an opportunity to share, etc., would be a wonderful, wonderful thing. There's something else too, I think, that I need to mention, and that is what makes this just is that knowing the whole story, recognizing that the Israelites themselves, and you might almost call this the tragedy of the Bible, which is that the standards that the other people are being held to, and the reason they're being destroyed, are going to be the standards by which the Jewish people themselves are going to be held to. That there's an expectation, and this goes deep into an understanding of what it is to know the nature of us as human beings and the nature of our lives and the purpose of our lives, etc. But the tragedy is that the Israelites are going to eventually get kicked out. They're not going to learn the lessons. And here they really are being warned very severely about what's going to happen to them if they don't, in fact, hold on to the mitzvot and don't hold on to the loyalty to God that they're supposed to, that they were, for which purpose they were created. And what is our purpose? I mean, this gets into some really beautiful challenges, which is, what is the purpose of life? Is it to try and get as much comfort with the least amount of bother? Is that the purpose of life? Is it to become as wealthy or powerful as we can? I mean, all those things we have to realize, given the fact that we're mortal, have limited value to them. On the other hand, trying to hold on to some of the values that we are talking about today in terms of kindness and the specifics, right? Deconstructing it, that's so important, right? That knowledge and deconstruction go hand in hand. And the more you want to talk about love, that's fine. But then you need to start deconstructing love and being able to see the differences and the subtle distinctions, et cetera, and also the situational issues that are involved in it. That's not only a challenge, but in some ways it gives our life a purpose, to discover what we mean by that and how to become and know in what situations we can be kind, and in what other situations that kindness is going to have to take the picture of justice, and holding people to the consequences of their behavior. And unfortunately, I pale into insignificance in terms of trying to understand and deal with these particular issues. So, yeah, but that's what we're doing. And I think, I'm comfortable at a point saying we have to look at ourselves as points of light. And all we can try to do is to lead by example and to try and if the world is a slightly better place because we passed through it, then we fulfilled our purpose. Well, what do we mean by the world is a better place? Well, that's what we're trying to define as we go through this and break it apart and deconstruct it through Rashi. Rashi, of course, is one level of deconstruction of the Torah. But that's, I think, how one does it. And this is also why studying together like we are today, hopefully, is a very satisfying activity that we really gain something from going through this particular process. So there's really some very beautiful stuff coming up, by the way, that in some ways is the antithesis of the kind of material that we've been dealing with up to now. So right now, we just read a sentence which said that if we try to hold on to these things, we will prosper. Let's keep going a little bit more. One more sentence. Unless I've got I think actually I do have a Rashi, right? So he says, Kol hamitzvah, all the commandment, kipshuto. He says, just the way it sounds. In other words, observing the commandments, practicing them. Umidrash agada. And he says, but there's also, a midrash on this from the Tanchuma. He says, Im hitchalta b'mitzvah. He says, if you begin to practice a commandment, gamor ota, you need to finish it, right? If you begin a mitzvah, complete doing it. She'ena nikret hamitzvah, because you're not going to be given credit for this mitzvah. Ella al Shem HaGomra. In other words, the credit for the performance of a mitzvah depends on who completes the mitzvah. And he's going to give you an example. Shenemar, as it states in Joshua chapter 24, it says, Ve'et atzmot Yosef, and the bones, in other words, the remains of Joseph, asher he'elu b'nei Yisrael. This is what it says, right? Joseph's remains, which the children of Israel brought up Mimitzrayim, that they brought up from Egypt, Kivru b'Shechem, they buried in Shechem. Right. So by the way, Joseph asks them, even though he is most successful, very powerful in Egypt, he says he predicts that that God is going to bring them out of Egypt and return them to the land of Israel. And he says, please take up my remains with you. He does not want to remain buried in Egypt. So, but the point is that here it says that the Israelites buried Joseph's remains in Shechem. But the truth is, we know that Moses was the one who personally took care of it, to bring them up. He was the one who went around, found the remains, found Joseph's remains, and made sure that he took them up with him when he left Egypt with the Israelites. Ella, however, the fisha lo hispik legamara, because he was not able to complete the mitzvah, which was, of course, to bury those remains. The Gamruha Yisrael, and Israel, the Israelites, completed it. Nikret al Shmam. That's why the verse in Joshua says they're the ones who brought up, right? Who actually brought up those remains. So trying to see something through right, is also, it's an interesting and something to think about, right? That just starting something isn't enough, but trying to go through the whole way, being committed to completing the entire process is terribly important. It's very, very important. And with this, I will stop today. Looking forward to continuing this tomorrow and hoping that you will really love what we're about to encounter. Okay. So I'll put this here. Yes, Judith, please.
Somewhat related. Finishing something is very important, but starting is important too. And somebody said, anything that's worth doing well is worth starting badly. And I am always moved when I hear Na'aseh v'nishma,
Yes.
because, you know, you say, oh, sure, I'll do that. And until you start doing it, you do not know what you have taken on. You don't know what's involved. You don't know what questions to ask. You don't know what more training you need in order to accomplish it. But if you don't start it, you'll never get what it is you need to have and to learn in order to complete it. It's important to complete it, but what is it? Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor,
Mhm.
velo ata ben horin
Yes.
lehibatel mimena.
Right. Right. So thank you. That's beautiful. You know, we sort of have a contradiction right there in that one sentence, right? It's not incumbent on you to finish the work, but on the other hand, you know, you shouldn't give it up. So I think it's, you know, I think the point that you're raising allows me to say that I think this is saying it rhetorically, that there's a level of rhetorical understanding to what's being said here. Because yes, being committed enough to start a process isn't easy, but sometimes starting something, we're all excited about it. And, you know, when you start something new, we know, you know, how things that are new can be very attractive and stuff like that. And yet hanging in there and seeing it through to the end is not nearly as attractive. It takes a lot of commitment and how can I put it, you know, your own inner drive and perhaps more of a rational side of things. And I think it's from a rhetorical point of view, simply saying how being able to complete a mitzvah that you begin is so important, and not to just start things, only because starting things, as difficult as that may be under certain circumstances, nevertheless is generally more attractive and more excited at the beginning of a process. I mean, it's so typical. Judith, I know you've experienced this. You start a class, right? Especially when you're teaching a class and it's a volunteer class and you get 20 people to show up at the first class, and then maybe there are 15 people at the next class, and then maybe there are 10 people at the next class, and then you wind up with the people that are really committed to the class. It's just, I think it's speaking to that element of us. And it's not that you can say everything, you can't see all 6 sides of the cube at one time, but from a rhetorical point of view, making the point that I'm trying to tease out, you know, in this way. Okay, I'm going to stop the share at this point and stop the recording.